I hope to see you again back on DoshTech. Hopefully it won't be in 2.5 years' time. Hello, it's been 2.5 years and that miserable British bloke that builds computers is back on YouTube. Well, not quite. I did, however, always promise myself when the time came I would make this video. What time would that be, you ask? Well, that exact time is June 2023, a significant time period for the 4 regular viewers that I have, who will tell you it's exactly 10 years since my first PC build was uploaded to this channel. Blurred lines were not only topping the music charts, but also the screen on my HP G62 laptop, which was melting itself towards an early grave, so something had to be done. Having saved up about £700 from my paper round at the time, I launched into the rabbit hole of custom PC building, and what parts I would need for my first build. Having made a number of sacrifices to factor in for peripherals, I was basically starting from scratch, of course. Me and my friend Colin, or my OG viewers will know them, Cool Tennis 01, set out to build a mid-range gaming PC with an AMD Phenom 965 quad-core and a GTX 650 Ti boost at its heart. So welcome back to DoshTech for one more episode where we take a look at the computer I so badly wanted but couldn't quite stretch to. By the way, something I should mention is this is the first computer I've ever built. Indeed it was, but this time it won't be in multiple parts, there'll be no juddery camera work and no minute-long intro video. So we know what I ended up with in 2013, but what did I really want? Well, for starters, I always had my eyes on the AMD Phenom lineup, for reasons of which I don't remember, as the AMD FX Bulldozer chips were just coming around the corner. And even if you go back a bit earlier to the Phenom's release, it still wasn't particularly good when it came out compared to the Intel offering. Nevertheless, I just thought the Phenom 6-core chips were pretty neat. So here we have the Phenom 2 X6 1090T, as for some reason the top-end 1100T still carries a price premium to this day. I mean, seriously, who actually wants to run one of these in 2023? Now, the next main component I had to cut back on was the graphics card. Now, I always thought the idea of owning an 80 series card was the ultimate flex, as they say nowadays. Therefore, back in 2013, when Kepler was the newest kid on the block, I set my sights on the GTX 680, with the 780 launching a few short weeks later. This Asus branded model features the blower style cooler, effectively the reference cooler, as was far more common at the time. And all of this was to be mounted to an Asus M5 A97R2 motherboard, as I was, and still am, not one for fancy ROG motherboards, so this was fine. And this is ultimately what I ended up using in 2013 anyway. So this is more or less the state the computer lies in now. Of course, when it first failed me, it was simply put away to one side, but it has since been used as been salvaged for parts. And as you can see, there's a fair number of major components missing. It has no processor, it has no RAM, graphics card, any drives, any cooler or anything like that. The power supply has been removed and put back in and not plugged in, so that's all loose, hanging around. And this is where we find ourselves today. So let's get some new parts and bring it back to its former glory that I once wanted it to be in. Seeing as the motherboard is already in, we shall go and start with the CPU installation. For this I have selected the AMD Phenom 2 X6 1090T, as the 1100 is still rather expensive. So we will open up the slot there, line up the arrow in the corner and drop it in. Little wiggle, nice and simple. Drop the lever back down and there it is installed. An awful lot less conundrum than there was in the first build. We've selected a water cooler for this particular build, so I'll start by removing the rear fan, as that is where the single 120mm radiator needs to mount to. So while I'm removing this fan, I shall explain some of the choices I've made with this build. Firstly, I've kept the existing case and power supply because the power supply is big enough and the case is pretty much more or less what I would have chosen at the time anyway. I've never been one for flashy computers with RGB and everything in them, so an understated case like this is pretty much what I'd have used anyway. The CPU, of course, came out in late 2010, and I started looking into building a computer around 2012, sort of mid-2012, when the FX was already on the horizon, if not had come out. Obviously the FX lineup are superior CPUs, but as I said before, I just really fancied the Phenom line, and of course they were good deals at the time, although I still couldn't stretch to the 6 core even back then, and ended up going for the 965 quad core, which was pretty good for a few years, and yeah, there you go, there's a fan removed. So in the relatively short, I suppose, 10 years or so that I've been messing around with custom computer equipment, I've never actually installed any sort of water cooling solution. So this is a H60. I probably would have gone for an H80 back in the day, but to be honest, I don't really want to go to that expense for this project. So this is an H60. I'm assuming the fan mounts like this with these long screws with the washers on them, and then the whole unit mounts in the back of the case where the old fan was removed from. So installing the AIO is as simple as positioning it in the rear of the case and then the pump on the CPU once I've mounted the radiator. So obviously there is some flexibility in those hoses, but not quite enough for it to stay in place while I attach this. Now we can install the pump unit. So first, of course, starting with some thermal paste on the CPU. A typically terrible DoshTech application there, for tradition's sake, and now let's throw the whole thing in there. There you go. The AMD mounting equipment for this does look a bit clunky, to be honest. So this bracket that is installed is part of it. Just need to sit that on top of there like that, and this piece here hooks onto the underside, onto the pre-mounted hook on the motherboard. And while holding the entire thing in place, you need to get one of these little thumb nut type things and screw it on, and then try and do the same the other side. So whilst not the most intuitive thing, I suppose that does mean you can use the standard mounting hardware. So now that's all tightened up, for the most part. Unfortunately the case does not particularly accommodate the AIO, as it's fairly sure it said on the description back in the day, but unfortunately only one of the holes actually lines up, and seeing as I can't be bothered to go and file it out right now, one screw is more than enough. I've tightened down the CPU pump unit, so now it's time to install the RAM. For the RAM, I've gone with a tried and tested unit from the day, very popular, the Corsair Vengeance. This is the old-fashioned stuff, the full height, with the massive heat spreader that likes to get stuck on most CPU coolers. Of course, when I built the original PC, I did indeed use this same stuff, and I used 16 gigabytes of it, DDR3 1600, as I'm using here today. And that's probably all I would have ever wanted. The original 16 gigabytes was excessive, to be honest, so this is fine for now. Fourth DIMM there, excellent, and I'll just give those all a good push down, and they're nice and tight installed. This presumably is a speed detection for the pump, which will plug into the second header along for the CPU, where the fan was previously. And rather neatly, it takes power from the serial ATA power, so that's nice and easy. I'll have to remove this old lead for the CX600. There There we go, as we now need an extra connector on the end. So I've managed to find from this original power supply the same lead, except this one has 3 plugs on it, so I should be able to plug everything in, including the disk drive, which I would of course need for installation of Windows. I've got a fairly open empty space in here. I shall route the motherboard main power connector and plug that in. Always was notoriously difficult on this particular board, I'm not entirely sure why, but it never quite wanted to click in. There we go. And of course the 8-pin CPU power supply, which we will need, obviously, as this is a very thirsty 125 watt TDP chip. There we go, we'll clean that up later. As is tradition with this case, because it has no 2.5 inch mounting bays, I will mount the SSD like so. I'll plug it in and it can just hang there in the breeze. And to quite literally plug a gap in the front of the PC, I'll install a card reader, as the original one also had one. Just take the quick release out there, push that in, and refit the quick release mechanism. So although it's notoriously difficult with this case due to the fact it has no area behind the motherboard tray, I'll spend a bit of time now and make this look as neat as possible, which is something I've neglected to do with the original build. So I'll get on with that and then we can get to the most important part. Far from the greatest cable management job ever done, but for this case I'm pretty happy with that. Now for the main event, which is of course the graphics card, and the whole reason I'm doing this. So for this I've selected an Asus branded, although it's the reference version, basically NVIDIA GTX 680. This is the card I originally wanted back in the day but couldn't quite afford, so I'm pleased to have it now. So let's get to installing it. And there we are. I'll screw that in. And I've also got 2 PCIs hanging out ready to go. Not really a great deal I could do to make those any neater, but that is the finished build. So here we are, 10 years later. Let's see if our upgrades are successful. And there we go. We have detected the Phenom 2 X6 1090T, it's running at the correct speed, and we have all 16 gigs of RAM detected. All the temperatures look good. So now it's just a matter of installing Windows and seeing how it performs in comparison to the computer I built back in the day, which, just as a reminder, had a Phenom quad core and a GTX 650 Ti boost. So we'll get the side panel installed, get Windows on, and see what it can do. So what you're seeing here is just a few basic benchmarks just to get a rough idea of performance. All graphical tests have been performed at high but not highest settings, 1080p resolution with 4x anti-aliasing. Owing to the complete failure of the last setup, I only have a few numbers we can use as a direct comparison, those being for GTA 5, which previously ran on the 965 quad-core and 650 Ti boost, at 11 FPS minimum, max of 78 and an average of 44. This upgrade sees those numbers jump to 33, 131 and 97 respectively. Cinebench R15, which was the last version I ran on the old setup, achieved 317 points on the quad-core, and on our new setup it achieved 471. Whilst I don't have exact numbers, vanilla Minecraft previously ran approximately 50 FPS average, and that's now bumped up to about 90. The classic Just Cause 2 Dark Tower benchmark ran an average of 115 FPS, and Far Cry 3, which was the main incentive for me to get my first gaming PC, ran a nice solid 75 FPS average. So whilst you could use this for a few modern games if you wanted to, certainly the less demanding ones, and like current titles, such as Minecraft or Rocket League or whatever, a lot of stuff like that, it would be fine. Of course, though, the power consumption of something like this is far greater than anything you'd use these days with a modern Ryzen chip, or indeed that of an Intel equivalent. Of course, graphics cards use an awful lot less power as well, and the noise as well is another thing to consider. They don't use as much power, therefore don't need as much cooling, and all the fans and everything are much quieter. In fact, these days I don't really see the point of going for a water cooling solution unless you're going for something really high end. Anyway, this is just something I wanted to do just to have a bit of fun, but other than that, that's about it. It's not really a very practical thing to be using these days, as I say, due to the power consumption. That's it though for another video on DoshTech, and I would say I hope to see you again soon, but to be honest, this probably won't happen again. So thanks for watching, and bye bye.